Hi, welcome to the week 1 video summary for computer-mediated communication. Before I start, let me see if I can minimize something on my screen. Oh, bummer. Oh well, okay. Basically what we're going to be doing today is I'm just going to be giving you sort of like an overview of what I think is really important from the readings. And this is good if you maybe didn't follow along some of the main concepts. I can clarify that for you. But one piece of advice I have is to go ahead and print out, I print out these I don't know what you call them, learning objectives or things that you should take away from this week, both because we'll be building on some of these concepts in future weeks and also because I'll be testing you on them for the exam. So this is kind of what I'm going to be using as an outline for our conversation. Not really a conversation, is it? It will be a conversation on the discussion board. So anyway, let's start off. We're going to be talking the majority of the time about some of the main theories of computer-mediated communication. There's actually not that many. We're going to cover what I call like the big ones, though, that are discussed here in this chapter. Before we start talking about those specific theories, the first learning objective on here is explain the cues filtered out perspective. How does this perspective view computer-mediated communication compared to face-to-face communication? And what I really want you to take away from this is that when people first started studying computer-mediated communication, right, when computers first started coming into our homes and we started recognizing the internet as a place that we could socially connect, the people who started studying it were basically assuming that whatever communication that we do via computers, and again, in this course, we're not just talking about computers, any sort of social media, text, texting would be computer-mediated communication. Even you can consider mobile phones computer-mediated communication. But what these guys sort of had in mind was that it's never going to be as good as face-to-face communication. So cues filtered out perspectives, I would say, in a nutshell, considers face-to-face communication to be the gold standard of communication. And there's lots of reasons for this, right? Because we know that in computer-mediated communication, you don't have all those nonverbal cues that you do in face-to-face communication. You could have some, but maybe not as many, and that's why we call it the cues filtered out perspective. It's the idea that when you're missing these social cues, communication can't be as good, it can't be as effective. You can't develop the same amount of intimacy with cues being reduced from the environment. So what are some cues that get filtered out? Well, if we're talking about instant messenger, for instance, you're really only in a text-based environment, so you miss all sorts of cues like facial expressions and voice tone, right? Skype is better at that. This video chat is a little bit better. You can see my facial expression. You still don't get all the cues. You don't know how I'm smelling. I'm actually smelling very good today. I have a very nice bottle of perfume that I put on, but I didn't do it for you, obviously, because that's a cue that would have gotten filtered out in this situation. Anyway, so cues filtered out was just a general mindset that people had when they started studying computer-mediated communication. And it's not necessarily wrong. Cues are filtered out, and that does limit us in some ways. But what the rest of the chapter talks about is how that's not the full story, okay? So Joe Walther, who's mentioned, on the title here, he is a communication researcher, just like I am. And in the early 90s, he was doing a lot of research on these cues filtered out perspectives. They mentioned some of them, by the way, at the beginning. Social presence theory is cues filtered out. Media richness theory. These are all theories that sort of presume that the more cues you have, the richer the communication is going to be, the better it's going to be. So he studied those things, and he said, but I'm not sure if that's the full story. It is true that missing some of those cues can inhibit how quickly we develop relationships or get to know somebody, but we do other things to get cues in, even when we don't have the normal nonverbal cues we're used to in face-to-face settings. Think about some of these. So if you don't have my facial expression, if you're just listening to me on the telephone, or if I'm just sending you text messages, aren't there still ways that I can make up for that? Aren't there ways that I can insert cues into that situation? Think about emoticons or emojis. Think about the use of different types of punctuation, like exclamation points. So his point was sort of like, even when we have less cues available to us, because maybe we're relying completely on text or something else, we can still make up for that, and we still should be able to have satisfying communication experiences even when we're online, even when it's computer-mediated communication. And he developed what's called here social information processing theory, that says essentially that face-to-face communication and computer-mediated communication can be equivalent. They can be equally as good. The only difference is that computer-mediated communication takes a little bit more time. Okay, so there's this great a metaphor that your reading mentions to help remember this. So SIP, S-I-P, right, is a good like abbreviation for that theory. Well, one way of understanding what the theory says is to think about how quickly we get the type of information from nonverbal cues. So think about if you're sipping and ha ha ha, it's not a beer, but it'll do. So there's lots of ways I can drink this bottle of water. At the end of the day, no matter how I drink it, I'm going to finish it, right? But if I sip it, I'm not going to be finishing the bottle as quickly as if I were to I'm not going to gulp, as if I would gulp all of the water, okay? So what Walther's social information processing theory says is that communication can be looked at in much the same way when we're talking about face-to-face versus computer-mediated communication, where you can still get little cues, little nonverbal cues filtered through even the most cues-reduced environment in computer-mediated communication. So again, instead of getting face-to-face, emotional expressions like again, we mentioned some before, voice or facial expressions. Other cues can leak through, okay? The use of emoticons or maybe all caps. Don't you always think that people who use all caps are always yelling? That's how I feel. But the point is that it still gives us the same information. It just might take a little bit longer for that information to get through. We're sipping the nonverbal information in that case, whereas in face-to-face settings, we actually gulp it. We can do it much quicker. And actually, I can't remember at the time, but it's actually mentioned in your chapter that specifically how much longer it takes to develop the same amount of information, the same quality of relationship that you would have face-to-face in computer-mediated communication. I think it's something around 20 minutes, but I guess I could look it up. I can't look it up fast enough. Oh, well, there's a really interesting explanation in here. 15 to 20 minutes, with both modes of communication artificially limited to 15 to 20 minutes. Okay, so essentially, if you give two strangers a task to get to know each other, you need to give the people who are communicating via instant message or some other sort of computer-mediated communication about 15 minutes longer than the people face-to-face, because it just takes them that much longer to pick up on the cues and get the same baseline impression. Okay, so this is a theory, again, that's kind of going against the grain of cues filtered out, because it's saying, well, yeah, cues filtered are out, but there are also some cues filtered in, right? But Walther later said that in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases, you can actually have a situation where computer-mediated communication leads to what we call hyper-personal communication. Think about it, not just personal, but hyper-personal, where if you communicate with somebody online, you can actually develop a more intimate relationship. You can get to feel like you know somebody more by communicating with them online than you would if you had communicated with them face-to-face. And I actually laid out, again, going back to the objectives here, what I'm talking about is this hyper-personal perspective. And I want you to know why this happens. And I list very specifically down here. Make sure you can explain selective presentation, attribution of similarity, asynchronous channel effects, and self-fulfilling prophecy. That's what I want to sort of talk about now. There's 4 conditions that Walther says can actually lead to this sort of hyper-personal communication. First of all, is this selective self-presentation. One of the reasons why online environments might be so good in some cases for making people feel like they know somebody else or really like them, sometimes this can be very positive, is because people have a lot more control over how they present themselves online. What I do offline, I can control to some extent, but once you see it, it's gone. If I mess up on this video and maybe drop the F-bomb or something like that, I can always go back and edit it out, right? Like, I can have a lot of control over how I present myself to you because I'm using this medium. The neat thing about that is, like, it makes you think a lot better of me than if you would have seen well, I don't know how you feel about the F-bomb, but if you would have seen me do something like this face to face, you can do all sorts of things to enhance how people see you. Think about how people do this on Facebook, right? I know I have a lot of friends who won't let me tag them in photos that they haven't approved yet, because to them, you know, one of the ways that they're controlling their presentation to other people is by making sure that only pictures that they think are going to present them as being very attractive go on there, right? So again, people can actually come to like each other more in online environments because they're really only seeing that really positive side of the other person. The other one I have on here, and of course is listed in your chapter, is the attribution of similarity. Another neat thing about computer-mediated communication is that a lot of times what's happening is people are communicating in places based around some sort of similarity. So maybe you go and you want to go into a sports chat forum to talk about other, you know, your love of the Pirates, sorry, near Pittsburgh, you know, or maybe you meet somebody on an online dating website because, you know, you both share some sort of interest. Well, the thing about similarity is when people presume that there is some sort of similarity that brought you together, then you tend to fill in other blanks thinking that that person is more and more similar to you. And we are attracted to people who are like us. So there tends to be an impression in online environments that when you're interacting with people, you highlight the ways that they're similar to you and not different. And of course, this also goes back to self-presentation too, because people are likely to highlight the things that make you more similar than different in a lot of cases, if you are trying to develop a relationship at least. The other issue, going also related to self-presentation, I'd say, is asynchronous channel effects. So if something's asynchronous, this is all over your syllabus, by the way. If something is asynchronous, it's not synchronous. It's not in sync, right? So it's not happening in real time. What that means is, like, if face-to-face communication is synchronous, because literally the minute that a word comes out of my mouth, when we're communicating face-to-face, you're giving me feedback, it's a back and forth, real time, this is happening now. Computer-mediated communication devices allow us to communicate much more asynchronously. So we kind of choose when we want to communicate things. So if I send you an email, you might get it, but then you have a while to, I'm not expecting an immediate response necessarily, so you can edit it and choose when you want to send it back, right? You have control over when the communication happens. The benefit of this, in some cases, is that people can be a lot more selective about the things that they choose to say, right? You can think about what you're going to say. Maybe you can come across as being a little bit more witty because you have time to develop a clever joke, or more intelligent because before you respond back to the instant message that you just got from somebody, you can quickly go and look up something on Wikipedia, right? So the benefits of having an asynchronous environment is that you can do things to help you come across as better, smarter, more attractive, what have you, okay? Maybe you only want to communicate when you're feeling in a good mood or something like that. All of these things can feed into people feeling more positively towards you because they're seeing the best of you, okay? Finally, there's this self-fulfilling prophecy effect that also encourages this hyper-personal communication. You could call it hyper-intimate maybe, but it doesn't necessarily mean sexual, right? Just hyper-friendly. So, the self-fulfilling prophecy effect is that, well, if you're getting to know somebody online and everything is coming across as being very, very attractive, right? So that this person's appealing, they're very similar to me. Sure, yeah, they had a little bit of time to think of that clever joke, but they're so clever, right? You're liking somebody, you're going to treat them as though you like them. People who are well-liked do get treated better. People are nicer to them. They use a nicer tone of voice with them. They make better assumptions about them. Actually, this isn't mentioned in your reading, but if any of you have taken COMM425 with me, you'll know that I'll talk about the halo effect a lot. So that's what it is. It's kind of like if we think somebody's attractive, then we tend to attribute other very attractive qualities to them. We also think that they're socially skilled and kind, right? So the thing about that is, if you start treating somebody like they're a nice person, the neat thing is they'll start responding back like they're a nice person. And here we kind of have this cyclical effect, because you're really attracted to somebody online because of their desirable self-presentation. They're really attracted to you. You guys are treating each other very nicely, right? Because you want to become friends. And when somebody treats you nice, you act in accordance to that. That's where the self-fulfilling prophecy comes in. So you actually start behaving in a way that's more conducive to developing a relationship than maybe you would have in a different type of setting. And this hyper-personal effect, right? This idea that, like, because cues are left out of the environment and we can fill in the blanks with those cues with very positive perceptions of people, and because we have more control over how we present ourselves in online environments, we can actually develop stronger feelings towards somebody, hyper-personal feelings towards somebody, compared to when we do face-to-face. This is going to come into when we talk about in the next unit things like catfishing. Like, have you ever asked yourself, how could somebody fall in love with somebody they've never met in person? Well, it's the hyper-personal perspective that actually explains that. It's the hyper-personal perspective that says it's actually quite normal if you think about it. It's more... it's probably harder to fall in love with somebody or in friend with somebody face to face, right? Because there are all those cues that you could sort of read in different ways. So anyway, that again is not consistent with that cues filtered out perspective. It's actually it's not saying that face to face is the gold standard for relationship development. What this is saying, the hyperpersonal perspective is saying, in some cases, it can actually be computer-mediated communication that could be a gold standard for different types of relationship development. I said on the objectives that I wanted you to be able to briefly explain this idea of social identity de-individuation. There's a abbreviation, the SIDE abbreviation, because we are going to focus on it a little bit more next week. I'm just going to read here the definition of it and explain why it's kind of important. Okay, so this is on page 144. Social identity de-individuation, a theory that suggests CMC users, and that's computer-mediated communication, we should get used to that, a theory that suggests that CMC users overestimate their similarity with others they meet in online interest groups. Okay, so we already talked about this a little bit, right? So this feeds into hyperpersonal communication, when we talked about attribution of similarity, but I want to talk just briefly about why that happens, and how what happens in computer-mediated environments can actually encourage this de-individuation. So let's just break apart the term for a second. If you're individuated, right, then you're thinking about yourself as an individual. You're very aware of yourself as, I am Dr. Cohen, right, and I like, I don't know if you can see this, I like crows, and this is something that makes me unique or whatever, and I am a comm professor, and I, right? It's all about me, what makes me an individual. Did I get that? Okay, fine. But if I'm de-individuated, that means that I'm not thinking about myself as an individual as much, which can make it more conducive to think about myself as a group. To think about, no, it's not I am Dr. Cohen and I, like crows. It's I am Dr. Cohen, a member of the Communication Studies Department, a member of West Virginia University. So I think about myself in terms of a group, and how I'm similar to other people in a group. And we're going to, again, kind of next week talk about more about how this could be a very good thing, and relating to, let's say, even a hyperpersonal communication. If you start emphasizing the similarity you have with somebody in your group, you could feel very attracted to them because of that sort of group cohesiveness you feel. And that's, again, allowed to happen when you're a little less individuated. But also, it can have some negative outcomes too, okay? Which, a little teaser, right? It could actually make you behave less inhibitedly, right? If you don't feel so responsible for your individual identity. So just a little teaser there. But one of the reasons this happens a lot in computer-mediated communication environments is because we also have control over how much of our identity we share. And how much of our identity we want to show. So think about when you go into chat rooms, and I don't even know if you go into chat rooms. I mean, just an aside, a lot of these theories are from like the early 1990s, when there wasn't even social network sites. So a lot of what people were doing back then were communicating anonymously or communicating without their identity. So you would make a screen name, and that screen name might not even have your name in it, but it could have different cues about what makes you individual, Dr. Cohen, Crow 32, or whatever, okay? Or it could actually not emphasize your identity so much. It could identify, it could be much more generic. Maybe it identifies me as a female. So if I say like blonde, blonde lady 42 or something, right? So it's not necessarily about me as an individual, but I have lady in there. So it could be about my group membership. Anyway, the point is that different types of cues that we give off and how we present ourselves can actually kind of affect our psychology about how we then interact with other people. Are we de-individuated, where we're not really thinking of ourselves as so much as as an individual as much as we are a part of the group, or are we actually doing things to increase our group identity? So there's different ways to vary that. But anonymity, that's key. We'll talk about that next time. Okay, and finally, just to sort of show you a little bit about how these things are studied. Now, Chapter 11, that social information processing chapter, gives you a really, really good explanation of how Joe Walther developed this theory of social information processing to begin with by doing an experiment where he actually compared the amount of time it took to develop, the same impression of somebody, whether you were, interacting with them online or whatever. Oh, sorry. It's my husband. Anyway, so what this is, this study right here is just another example years later of where they're doing the same thing. They're testing the same theory. And I'll try to keep reminding you of this. These studies are really hard to read. And if it doesn't come naturally to you, then you shouldn't feel like anything's wrong with you. It's just written in a very dry scientific language to sort of keep out bias, right? It's not editorializing anything. It's written in a very objective way, and that's part of the value of them. But it does take a little practice to get used to reading it, so just bear with me. So I'll let you read like the literature review for yourself, or maybe you already have. What I want to focus on is more of this methodology, because I think this is key. What they're trying to do is they're trying to figure out what exactly, if people are communicating in a cues-reduced environment, one of these computer-mediated communication environments, can they still communicate different types of emotion? And how is positive emotion communicated versus negative emotion? Now, we've already sort of talked about this, because social information processing theory would say, yes, of course, right? Even when you don't have all of the nonverbal cues, you can still get things across. But what they were actually looking at is, how do they get these things across? What is it if I only give somebody an instant messenger? What do people use to communicate different types of emotion? Okay, so that's their main question. And their procedure here, I'm going to walk you through this. It says participants were randomly assigned to expressor and naive partner roles. Okay? Expressors were instructed to act as if they were experiencing positive or negative emotion. So picture yourself coming into a lab on campus, and unbeknownst to you, you don't know anything about this, you're randomly assigned, which means that the researchers don't really choose you. It's just sort of like a flip of the coin, to go into one group. And in this group, what you're told to do, well, you're not really in a group, but you're part of a group of people. You as an individual are instructed to go and interact with another individual on instant messenger. But one of you has been told to play out an emotion, sort of act out an emotion. And this, it's for, let's see, it says, yes, if you act happy as if you have just received excellent news, and some people were told to act sad as if they just received terrible news. Okay, the person who you're communicating with hasn't been told to act anything out. Okay, so they haven't been told to do anything. This is going to allow the researchers to figure out how do the people who are told to act negatively communicate that? What kind of different types of lingual cues are they going to choose to use, and does that differ from the people who are happy? But more importantly, they're going to be able to ask the people who are on the other side of this interaction whether or not they understood that the person was happy or not, right? So they're going to be able to see two different things here. They're going to be able to see what types of cues were being used to convey different emotion, and then was it even effective or not? Did they get their message across to the other person who they're communicating with? And again, there's lots of details here, and nobody expects you to understand advanced statistics. But what I really would like you to get out of reading these articles is that even if you don't understand statistics, you can read through them and still get an idea of what was found. So if you see charts like this, right here, like all this, you don't need to worry about like the numbers in the results section. But if you read the results section, and particularly the discussion section, they're going to summarize exactly what they found. You can see, like, there's on page 931, it'll say detection of emotion. So there's a subtitle there. And they just spell it out. They say the data revealed that the naive partners, those are the people who didn't act out the emotions, were able to detect the expressor's emotional state. Right there. So it worked. So even though these people were not communicating face to face, they still were able to get their emotions across. Okay? And again, there's numbers after that, you can ignore that. So what else did they find? Well, another question, of course, was what kind of strategies were they using? Well, it says up here, and now I'm going to look just to kind of give you a feel for where to go. In the discussion section is where they discuss all this. But they talk about how the first strategy, this is in the second paragraph of the discussion section, the first strategy involved changing the degree to which the expressor agreed with their partner. Positive affect users reported trying to agree more with their partner, which is consistent with strategies used to express liking and disliking. Okay, so and this isn't even a text-based thing. What they're saying is that when they told people to act like they were happy, happiness was expressed just through the act of agreeing with the person that they were communicating with. The negative people, the people who were told to be negative, didn't do that, right? But there were some lingual things too. The second strategy was more direct and involving simply using more or less negative affect terms, but not positive affect terms. Makes sense, right? When you're not happy, you tend not to use words that convey happiness, like happy or jovial or those types of things. In fact, you might even use other types of words. These are all ways, though, I know it's obvious, but as far as this study is concerned, this is saying this is why computer-mediated communication can be good, just as good as face-to-face communication, given more time. This is why it supports social information processing theory. And they did. If you read the rest of the discussion, there's a number of different strategies that they identified. So one way to look at this is, now this is 2007, and Walther's social information processing theory was 1992. Now, years later, right, we're still trying to test to figure out exactly why it is that computer-mediated environments can be equal to the types of messages that we get in face-to-face communication. When does that happen? Why does it happen? Those are the types of questions we're tackling. So, okay, I think that pretty much does it for the first week. If you have any specific questions, you know to go to the discussion board, and of course, I'll have specific forum conversation starters, I guess is what I should call them, posted up there so that we can talk a little bit more about these things and relate them to maybe some examples in our own lives, hopefully. So, thanks.